Hello, friends. Good evening. Welcome all of you to Usanas Foundation's another discussion on the role of extra-regional factors in fueling this Hamas-Israel conflict. As we all know that this 7th October attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians and deep inside the Israeli territory has kind of shocked the entire world, as if the conflicts were not enough. This conflict has added another dimension to this whole world order going in turmoil and transition. It has raised several questions with long-rooted and long-term and deep impacts in the future. But for this webinar discussion, we are going to discuss a question which is being raised in muted tones: the role of extra-regional actors in fueling this Hamas-Israel war. So far, definitely, as we all know, that Iran has come up openly, and it is more or less clear that Iran is behind this attack, and Iran's proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, are already in war with Israel. But what about the other actors? Well, the other are Arab states. Privately, they are very happy with Israel crushing Hamas and Hezbollah. But the actors beyond the region, yes, I am talking about China and Russia. So the question arises, the kind of sophistication which was witnessed in the attack, I mean, that generally doesn't come from a mere terrorist or a non-state actor. And then the question is that, I mean, well, we are still not very sure to say whether Chinese or the Russians orchestrated it. But the question is that, do they stand to benefit from this attack? Well, the answer to this question is yes. So today we have some of the finest and leading experts on the subject with us today. We have Mr. Burzine Waghmar, who is a senior fellow with Usanas Foundation and also a visiting India fellow with RUSI, and he's with SOAS. Then we have Dr. Sriparna Pathak. She's the leading China expert in India, and she is a professor at Jindal Global University. And without wasting much time, I'll just straight away hit the ground running. I'll invite Dr. Burzine Waghmar, the historian in Burzine Waghmar, to give a brief background of this Israel-Hamas war and the Palestinian conflict. 10 minutes, Burzine. You know, for our viewers, you have to come up with a very holistic picture of this whole conflict, and the background.
Thank you, Dr. Pandya, and to Preeti for arranging this seminar. Good evening to everyone in India, and good afternoon to those joining us from Israel and elsewhere. Israel was the first state in the region to recognize Mao's China in 1950, a gesture only reciprocated by Beijing's acknowledgement of Jerusalem in 1992. Arafat's PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, opened a representative office in Beijing 1965, which in 1984 was raised to a full embassy status. In the intervening years, China supplied weaponry to Palestinian militants through the ports of Latakia, Alexandria, and Basra. Ba'athist Iraq and Syria, as well as Nasserist Egypt, radical Arab regimes whose anti-colonial socialist orientation dovetailed with revolutionary China, were anxious to demonstrate its anti-Western hostility, dressed as solidarity with decolonized regimes, thus bolstering its credentials in the Islamic world. The Palestinians, like other Arabs, steadfastly held to a one China policy, especially after the PRC, People's Republic of China, entered the UN and permanent seat at the Security Council in 1971 and the expulsion of Taiwan. Besides the PLO, other more extremist Palestinian groups too, like George Habash's PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, notorious through the 1960s and 70s for worldwide hijackings and airport bombings, was supplied weaponry and maintained representatives in Beijing. Fatah fighters routinely traveled to China to receive military training from the PLA, People's Liberation Army. Palestinians, for their part, were chary of upsetting Mao following the late 50s Sino-Soviet split and veered more towards Beijing than Moscow. Chinese confrontational diplomacy was geared towards challenging not just the imperialist powers, but also Moscow, which did not, at that point, recognize the PLA. Stalin's USSR, you will recall, like Truman's USA, readily recognized Israel's creation on the afternoon of 14th May 1948. China was deeply involved in the near unraveling of Jordan following that Black September 1970 uprising, when Palestinian militias almost succeeded in overthrowing the Hashemites. A certain Brigadier Zia-ul-Haq, on secondment to the Jordanian military, saved King Hussein's skin. Mao's China, during its extreme leftist phase since its 1949 founding, was then in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76, and supported the Palestinians even when other Arab states were not in favor of the Jordanian monarchy being toppled. China was deeply engaged in the Jordanian civil war between the army and those Palestinian militants based in Jordan. The latter's arsenal was entirely China-supplied. Beijing was unusually vociferous globally in attacking personally the late King Hussein, the Jordanian monarchy, army and state at various fora and in the media. Black September Palestinian terrorists who murdered Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Beijing through the 70s, following détente between Washington and Moscow, blamed both powers for sponsoring regional hostilities and defending Israel's right to exist. This not only bolstered Beijing's credentials as a revolutionary voice in the Afro-Asian world, but also played to domestic sentiments given its own Uyghur and Hui Muslims. Lebanon, like Jordan, was ravaged by two wars with Israel in 1978 and 1982. The government during both conflicts suffered thanks to locally entrenched Palestinian militias stoking that 1975 to 1990 civil war, which nearly destroyed Lebanon. Sino-Lebanese relations only improved after Beijing acceded to Beirut's request to halt shipments of arms to Palestinians. Beijing adopted a pragmatic stance following Deng Xiaoping's assumption of office in 1978. After realizing trade, but particularly military ties could be cultivated in the region with conservative regional monarchies who were generally pro-Western and against the godlessness of Marxist regimes, whether Moscow or Beijing. China supported the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference following the Gulf War I, which led to realizing Israeli achievements in defense and agricultural technology. China came to conclude that it could procure military know-how from Israel, which had enviable access to American arms and technology as no other country. China rapidly realized Israel was unable to oblige, but this has not dented bilateral technology transfers and scientific collaboration. This 21st century Sino-Israeli relationship puts in the shade Beijing's trade and hydrocarbon ties with all countries in the Middle East. Sino-Israeli partnering did not prevent China from recognizing Hamas following its 2006 electoral victory. China displays no objection to dealing with Islamists, whether Hamas representatives or those of the Muslim Brotherhood in the short-lived administration of Egyptian Prime Minister Mohamed Morsi. Not that any of these Sunni extremist groups have publicly condemned the anti-Islamic indoctrination, internment, rape and torture of fellow Sunni Uyghurs. Inasmuch as China, like India, did not historically have a legacy of anti-Semitism, this contemporary outburst of bigotry is evinced now in conspiratorial, left, ultranationalist domains of Chinese cyberspace. Tropes of decidedly European inspiration, hitherto alien to the Sinitic worldview, now frequently circulate alleging COVID-19 was a Judeo-American complot or that Jews universally engender pandemics, global financial crises, and wars. It is a sobering reminder how anti-Israeli positioning inevitably blurs into outright anti-Semitism and is not a monopoly of the alt-right, but flourishes in liberal progressive circles and leftist circles within Western academics, socialist or green parties, celebrities, social influencers, and leftist media outlets. I have, as a historian, outlined Sino-Palestinian relations. In bringing the past to bear on the present, I posit the following remarks in conclusion. The PRC has and does enjoy positive relations with the Muslim Middle East, Arab, Iranian, Turkish, as well as Israel. It is a major trading partner of all the aforementioned. Commerce drives, dictates, and determines the Chinese worldview of the Middle East. Ideally, it would prefer this most conflict-racked region of the world, with simmering ancient hatreds and rivalries, were not in the situation it is perennially. Israel versus Gaza, Iran versus Saudi Arabia versus UAE versus Yemen, Qatar versus the GCC, and last but by no means the least, Iran versus Turkey, who jockey for political leverage, Islamic prestige, and settling scores through proxies to determine geostrategic outcomes in the region. Both Iran and Turkey, note, are nation states compared to these artificial Arab entities created only during the last century. China pulled off earlier this year something of a diplomatic coup by brokering a resumption of relations between Tehran and Riyadh. It is arguable that Beijing can wield some influence over Tehran, perhaps not so much as it admittedly can with Islamabad, for instance. But those who propose that China can moderate Iran to dial down the tension or stay Hezbollah's hand from unraveling the region further miss pointing out this salient feature of the Chinese, namely their instinctive reticence to walk the talk. Beijing steadfastly eschews being sucked into inter and intra-regional rivalries. It is not interventionist and can offer nothing towards any solution in the Middle East now or ever. And this is not just the Middle East or the current Palestinian imbroglio. Beijing, as a rule, is wary of being sucked into the domestic or regional politics of other regions too, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Pacific, which do not have a direct bearing on its strategic interests and assets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Burzine, for an excellent overview of the history of Sino-Palestine relationship. I'll come back to you with some more questions, but before that, I would like to go to Dr. Sriparna Pathak. Dr. Pathak, as we all know that, the very strong Chinese strategy, the key element of Chinese strategic culture is that stability inside and maximum instability or insecurity outside. That's what they want. They want the countries keep running to them. So now, given this idea, and given the fact that you've been studying China for a long time, you've done a lot of work on their influence and intelligence operations. What exactly could be the motivation, behind this involvement in this war? What the long-term perspectives, the long-term objectives, and the nature of Chinese involvement? How do you look at it? I would like to know your thoughts. Over to you, ma'am. You are on mute.
Thank you so much, Abhinav. And thank you, Preeti, for organizing this. I think Preeti has very kindly already put my slides on the screen because it's not me who has shared it. So thank you so much. And, as I change the slides, I'll just request you to, move on to the next slide. So I think Dr. Waghmar has brilliantly put everything into perspective already. It's always important to understand the history, to understand where exactly we are right now. And the question which I raise here is China fueling the Hamas war against Israel. Next slide, please. Even though we know it, yet it's pertinent to state that the current and established world order is that of a liberal democratic world order. However, neither are China, Iran, nor Russia democracies, nor does the existing principles of liberal democracy work well for their planned revisionist world orders. While China unilaterally attacked India in 2020 at the borders, Russia did the same to Ukraine in 2020, last year, 2021, 2022. And in 2023, through its proxy, which is Hamas, Iran does the same to Israel. For the West, the conundrum which is created in the Middle East deflects its attention and energies from the Russia-Ukraine theater of war, as well as from China's aggression in the Taiwan Straits crisis. China, right now, wants to depict itself as a peaceful and responsible player in the international system, and all the narratives that it has pushed out since, not just, Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, but since China brokered this peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, every narrative that it's pushing out is that China is the better option in the Middle East, and that, countries across the world should rather follow the Chinese model of governance, Chinese model of economic development, Chinese leadership, and so on. Now, China has not only been sustaining the Iranian economy against US sanctions, but has also been indirectly supplying Chinese-made weaponry to Hamas through Iran. Needless to state, China has not even condemned the terrorist attacks undertaken by Hamas against Israel. Next slide, please. The nexus of oil, weapons, and money flows for illicit purposes between Iran, China, and Hamas becomes a very problematic one. Hamas's leader Ismail Haniyeh, he acknowledged in an interview back in 2022 last year that his group had received $70 million in military assistance from Iran. According to a State Department report from 2020, Iran provides about 100 million US dollars annually to Palestinian terrorist groups, including Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, and so on. Now, the biggest importer of Iranian oil is China, and it's the biggest importer in the world. So, through its oil supplies, through its monetary transactions, it does support Iran. In addition to this, as per Israeli intelligence reports, that of Israel's internal security agency, Shin Bet, there is an existence of a very sophisticated international network to finance the activities mainly of Hamas and of the Islamic Jihad, and the Bank of China is at the center of it. Funds are transferred to accounts in India and Turkey as well. The revelations were actually a result of an ongoing legal battle between the Bank of China and the family of a victim of a terrorist attack in Jerusalem in 2006. According to the lawsuit, which was filed with the backing of the Israeli government, the Bank of China was used to launder terrorist funds, and the authorities in China ignored Israeli warnings. Now, the suit revealed transfers of millions of dollars to the Bank of China in the last decade. But sadly enough, under pressure from China, Israel backtracked, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu instructed his officials not to testify in the case against the Chinese bank. This is in 2000. This is from 2006 onwards. So you can imagine how much of money laundering for terrorist purposes has happened by now. Next slide, please. China also sponsors Hamas's weapons arsenals. As per Strategic Assessment Report of 2009, various types of long-range projectile weapons were used by Hamas against Israel, which are all of Chinese make. Israeli military intelligence made a revelation regarding the origins and specifications of the weapons and communication systems used by Hamas. This analysis has uncovered a concerning association between Hamas and China, suggesting the utilization of Chinese-made arms and mobile communication systems in the ongoing conflict. In 2008 itself, in December, when Hamas had fired 60 missiles at Israel, it was noted that the missiles were not short-range or the homemade Qassam rockets, which make up the bulk of Hamas's arsenals, nor were they the longer-flying 122mm Grad rockets, which were designed by the Soviets and made in Iran. Some of the rockets flew an alarming 22 miles, and they were made in China. These weren't short range, right? These are the ones which China has a specialty in. The scenario only got worse in 2023. While the analysis is still on as to where the weapons are really from, a lot of it comes from China, a lot of it comes from Russia. But these are some statistics back from 2008 itself, which shows how much or how long enough China has been supplying arsenals to Hamas. Next slide, please. A factory in Shantung province of Communist China was boasting on Chinese social media that it is providing an upgraded advanced weapon for Hamas, and an investigative report from Jerusalem Post also found Chinese characters engraved on Hamas's artillery. Russia's finance minister publicly admitted that almost all their drones were produced by Communist China. Next slide, please. With the help of video and photos of Hamas militants, CNN was independently able to identify where the weapons were used by Hamas to carry out attacks inside Israel came from. Now, CNN's Oren Lieberman, he has done an extensive report on this, and he discussed this with the Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson, Jonathan Conricus, and you can find it in open source searches as well, in which it is discussed that the assault rifles and the grenades which were carried by Hamas were made in China. The weapons were actually low-tech, and low-tech weaponry was what was used in the initial attacks on October 7th. It was done just to create chaos, and then further, much more advanced artillery was used. Next slide, please. In addition to supplying arms and arsenals, China has also launched massive cognitive warfare, actively using disinformation against Israel and supporting Hamas. And there are scores of such social media posts, which then find ways into posts of other terrorist sympathizers across the globe and churn out propaganda to unleash psychological warfare. And all of these have the starting point in social handles in China. And as we all know, social handles are strictly monitored in China. Chinese dissidents themselves have posted on social media that Hamas's military commander, Mohammed Deif, the mind behind this October 7th attack, he was trained in China. He has a Chinese wife. Some even say two Chinese wives. But the fact is that when he was in prison, Mohammed Deif was sent to China by the PLO in 1996, and he studied at the People's Liberation Army's Ordnance Engineering College. He studied artillery technology over there, and his classmates thought he was from Pakistan. Deif's then Chinese name was Musafu, or in English, Musaf. Next slide, please. On the Al Ahli hospital blast, as is now known, the bombs were planted by Hamas underneath the hospital premises. Before the terrorist attack, the Chinese Communist Party replaced all of Hamas and local government existing iPhones or other brands with their Huawei and Xiaomi cell phones as counterintelligence measures. 2 weeks before the attack, the CCP sent an unusually large volume of military supplies and personnel through Egyptian ports and airports, then distributed them to Syria and Lebanon. In the leaflets, which were found by Israeli medics from the bodies of Hamas militants, the leaflets describe how to combat Israeli tanks and armored vehicles, the differences between Chinese Type 40 rocket launcher and the Russian RPG-7, and so on. What's the need to, talk about the Chinese Type 40 rocket launcher if it's just not there? Clearly, it was there, and which is why there was a need to give out these pamphlets to the terrorists. Next slide, please. I think this is the last slide, but just to conclude, why is China doing this? Israel is an important trade partner for the CPC, but then why is it actually doing this? It's doing this because it wants to be the leader of the international system. It wants to instill its own autocratic world order in place. For the purpose, it uses a dual track policy of trying to appear as the leader of the global south, which is why it'll talk about Palestine, it'll talk about Arab people's rights, it'll talk about Middle East, etc. At the same time, it will use terrorism as a tool to force in its own changes. And it'll do this so that it can contrast itself to the US, which luckily or unluckily is still the leading power of the international system. China will showcase itself as a humanitarian force while it leverages the tool of terrorism, arms supplies to militants, and shady banking networks to fuel conflicts to support its own rise. So I'll just end here, and I look forward to bigger questions, and a discussion on the topic. Thank you so much, Preeti.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pathak, for detailing. Sorry. Thank you very much, Dr. Pathak, for such a detailed overview of Chinese, this unholy nexus with Hamas and the different routes which they are using to support and facilitate Hamas in various forms. In fact, China's umbilical cord with terrorism is more than evident. Even India has faced a lot of it. They've always defended terrorists like Masood Azhar, Hafiz Saeed in the UN Security Council. And I mean, it's well known. Even in Kashmir, those Norinco weapons have been often found with the militants. So this is something which actually shouldn't have come as a surprise to all of us. But then I don't know why it's still being talked in muted tones. Definitely, I mean, there has to be some reason behind it. But yes, so I'll come back to Burzine. Burzine, you gave an interview to Republic TV in which you talked at length about how China is fueling Hamas war. And can you just tell us a little bit more about this whole issue of China fueling the Hamas war?
Dr. Pathak has done it excellently, and I learned so much in the last 10 minutes about Hamas and China that I never thought before. I but only touched the tip of the iceberg in my Republic TV broadcast last week when I read in a certain monograph on Sino-GCC relations, and the chapter therein by Professor Mohammed Olimat of the University of Southern Florida, wherein he mentioned that Chinese C-700 missiles were intercepted by the Israeli Coast Guard, which was bound for the Gaza Strip in March 2014. That consignment came from Assad's Latakia port. Back then in the 60s, also during Ba'ath Syria's time, and which is still Ba'ath Syria even now. So the more it changes, the more it seems the same in the Middle East, as one says. And what the Israeli Coast Guard found in that consignment, which was intercepted, was well, predictably, Iranian Fajr missiles. But what was the scoop was this: Chinese C-700 ones that were promptly confiscated. And as I pointed out, Dr. Pathak has done a better job of it than I ever could. It's at the same time, everyone seems to be sucked into this trade relationship, whether India or Israel, that they can't extricate themselves from it because the costs and overheads are too steep, which is why Netanyahu's office quashed that contention, legal contention, and nothing could proceed for that plaintiff, for example. One often hears, even in the Indian context, as to why we can't wean ourselves away when Indians ask this aloud, but the price would be too heavy, given that there is a surplus in terms of trade. In the Sino-Israeli context too, Beijing, as I pointed out, and this is what I feel was an important historical insight I did bring to bear, is that the Chinese came to realize that Israel is the closest to the US, and that could just about tip the scales in our favors. But of course, Washington privately has made it known to Tel Aviv down the years that there can be no question of technology transfer of any sort to Beijing. And Israel, for the most part of it, has adhered and not done anything to violate that. There is an Indian case to be brought in here, and it's not a digressive point. When the Islamic Republic of Iran's Navy sent its submarines to Bombay's Mazgan docks for midlife maintenance and tropicalization of batteries, because those Soviet batteries were made for Arctic waters. I'm referring to around 2005, when President George Bush Jr. came on a state visit to India, the visit which heralded later the Indo-US nuclear agreement and all of that. At that point in time, even as Bush was flying in to New Delhi, Iranian submarines were in Bombay, and Iranian naval contingents were being trained. Some level of modular courses were being offered to them at Cochin and at Vizag. And Washington has made it known to Delhi, and of course India would be, I'm sure, equally chary that they don't want Iranians snooping around their facilities or trying to procure know-how of stuff as such. Not just American equipment, but even of Indian equipment. Washington was concerned about that, and over the years has privately brought to bear that to Indians that is simply not on, and you need to be wary of it. So there is a question of defense deals and trade deals which brings to bear, and it's a Chinese dilemma that many countries tend to face.
Burzine, so now, yes, you haven't discussed at length, how Chinese are involving and what the long-term objectives are with this war. I mean, we can all see that some sort of a global alliance has already come up, in which we see China, Russia, Iran, and loosely Qatar and Turkey on one side, and now also get North Korea along with them. So this is on the one side, and on the other side, we have the Americans and Israel and India in a very vague manner, I must say, and then the Western European powers.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and very ambivalent.
And then the Arab states are there who are still not very clear with their positions. They're just watching and observing. So, I mean, this question, I mean, this is about, like, do you think that this new front in the Middle East could have been an idea to divert attention from the Ukrainian war front?
In one sense, yes, it's a godsend blessing for Putin. Let's not deny that. He must be thanking his stars to have this respite, which he has. And that's one point. Second point for Tehran, of course, which was viewing things were moving too fast between Riyadh and Jerusalem, and that relations would have been struck between both countries, Saudi Arabia and Israel. So that could have also, in all probability, led to Iran trying to muddy the waters, which they have done with this incident. And also because, which goes back to Iran's Sunni Shia Saudi rivalry, dead set ancient hatreds, which I mentioned about. And of course, there's that question of the Saudis, the Iranians, and the Turks jockeying for, as I said, Islamic prestige. Much of this has to do with Muslim machinations and internal Muslim politics, which is lost on the Western world and the non-Muslim world, including India, China, and others at large. You need to come in with an Islamic history or historian's perspective to understand that this is all about Muslim one-upmanship and score settling, which is dressed in the name of unity, that is Ittihad and Tawheed, which is a very enduring Islamic concept, the unity of believers, because of the whole corporate loyalist sense that Islam demands of its adherents, whether Sunni or Shia, and where you do see this one voice unison outrage towards Palestine, but which is, of course, very selectively calibrated and can be dialed up and down. But the deafening silence of the Muslim world on, well, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And so much so that most of the Arab world, the GCC and Iran and Turkey, have bought into Beijing's narrative that these are secessionist elements who want to unravel China. And we have a live and present, clear and present danger of a security issue at home. So please understand that it's got nothing to do with targeting Muslims per se. And all of them in the Gulf have bought into this. Even if they have not privately acknowledged it, they have bought into it. Turkey, of course, at one point in time, because of the pan-Turanian element and the Xinjiang Turkic element, has had Uyghur refugees in Istanbul and Ankara. But Erdogan once did speak about it, but after that he has gone conveniently silent. Again, Sino-Turkish trade ties and the rest of it, which lead him to do so. But as you point out, and here I come to your first point, and as Dr. Pathak put it, this whole global South brigade, us versus them, standing against the so-called white imperialist West, which is anything but white, anything but imperialist, but is of liberal democracies tied to international norms of governance and practice, not run by authoritarian states, which believe in midnight knocks on the doors of their citizens or checking their social handles of Twitter or elsewhere, but coming in to just position themselves with this third world nativism and politics of us versus them, and to offer a better deal. And China is the vanguard of it. Iran and Turkey have nothing to offer, but China tends to posit itself with Chinese-style governance and a Semitic worldview that is a better option, that somehow is not like America messing about in the Middle East, which it has been doing since 1945, or the British with the baggage of imperialism, or the French with the baggage of imperialism. And they do tend to play that point up time and again in the Middle East and in Sub-Saharan Africa, that we come in with good intentions. We never conquered you. We never exploited you. We are just colored fellow Asian third world citizens like you and the sort. So it all builds into all that pseudo-Marxist, leftist, pseudo-progressive narrative, which is essentially, quite frankly, Afro-Asian racism, if you ask me, and lashing out at whites just simply for being whites. So, the last point is also an important one in conclusion. None of the Arabs want to talk about Palestine because it's a headache for them. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, all of them know that the Palestinians are a nuisance. I pointed out what they did to what happened to Jordan in the 70s and to Lebanon in the 80s. The Palestinians are bad news, period. That's why they don't want them on their shores, which is why even Qatar would not want to take in refugees, which is an empty peninsula. And why can't they take in these refugees, 2 million from Gaza, fellow Arab Sunni Muslims? But also because they don't want to have them. Apart from the trouble factor is, they may ostensibly say, well, we don't want to empty out Gaza because that means Palestinians will be whittled out of the region historically and the Jews can take over the land. That's what they want to try to portray. And that's what they want to project persistently in their narrative. That's why we are refusing to take in the refugees. But actually the reason is they know that the Palestinians have been consistently bad news for other Arab regimes. The Jordanian ambassador in New Delhi in 1983 was shot dead in Vasant Vihar, New Delhi, on his doorstep by Abu Nidal Palestinian militants. Pan Am 73 took off from Bombay on September 5, 1986, and on its brief stop in Karachi before heading to Frankfurt and New York was hijacked by the Abu Nidal hijackers. And you remember Indians were murdered, including the Pan Am crew was murdered on that flight. In March 1988, the Alitalia crew at Bombay airport again was targeted by Abu Nidal Palestinian militants. It is interesting here I can bring in the Indian element, which was militancy. And Mr. Pandya, the Alitalia Italian crew, which has nothing to do with that incident, the captain of the Alitalia crew of the crew bus was shot outside Bombay airport because the Palestinians thought it was an Air France crew. The Air France flight was arriving 40 minutes late, and that had to do with the Lebanese and the French relations and the rest of it. So they mistook the Italians, they shot him dead, and they created havoc too. Not to mention Sir Percy Norris, the British Deputy High Commissioner in Bombay in 1984, November 84, a few weeks after Mrs. Gandhi's death, who was shot dead at 8 in the morning while heading to the Deputy High Commissioner's office here. 40 years on, we still don't know, but we do know it was the Abu Nidal gang that was involved in this. So the Palestinians are bad news, and it's no point pretending about it, including countries which, like India, which have supported and with third world solidarity at NAV movements, non-aligned movements and the like, speaking about Palestinian solidarity. But India has suffered due to the Palestinians and prefers to keep mum about it. And all during those ensuing years, India preferred not to extend a hand to Israel, much as David Ben-Gurion wanted to do so. Nehru was reticent about it in the 50s. The consulate opened in 1953 in Bombay, and Ben-Gurion wanted to raise it to an embassy status, which Nehru politely declined. And of course, under Indira Gandhi in the 60s and 70s, it was a consistently pro-Gulf policy. And at one point, the Israeli Consul General in Bombay in 1982, at the height of the June 82 Lebanon war, did mention, and I'm so glad he was gutsy enough to mention, that the Indians are in hock to Arab money and oil money, which is why they will never take a stance and come out with independent policy. And promptly, of course, India declared the Consul General persona non grata, and he had to leave Bombay within the week. But and then India actually downgraded in Bombay to a vice consulate status for a while too. So there is something to be said about Israel being consistently marginalized, and that all of us in the world raise the bar for Jews, but lower it for Muslims and others. And there is a patent unfairness involved in this. And when Jews do speak about it, they have a point on one standard for us, but consistently so for others as such.
Thank you, Burzine. I'll come back to you with some more fundamental issues pertaining to this issue. But before that, let me go back to Dr. Pathak. Dr. Pathak, in case if this conflict escalates, as we can see some of the early symptoms, Hezbollah has already threatened, and I really don't know how long Iran can wait for getting into the real conflict. And imagine if it gets to the Arab street and there is some more involvement. But do you think, I mean, what would be the Chinese long-term strategy, to this war? Will they actively participate, or would they like to take some advantage of the situation in the Middle East, in the Taiwan Straits, or let's say, or do something really outrageous on the Himalayan borders? Can they go to that extent?
China can go to any extent. If say other actors actively jump in, as you say, if it's say, the neighboring states of Israel, if they do actively come in, China would still actively come in. They will still sell these shady arms, because they want to show their face as a responsible player in international politics. So they cannot be seen, butchering Israeli forces or butchering Israeli people, which is why they'll still try and, arm these terrorist forces, and all these, revisionist states in the Middle Eastern region through its arms supplies, through these very shady banking mechanisms, etc. But it will not join in directly. See, China would want things to be problematic in the Middle East, because then it can show that the US is, it's not a great player, it cannot maintain stability, etc. But as you said, its primary focus is near its own borders. Even in the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping has talked about regional conflicts. Regional basically means Taiwan and India. Out of Taiwan and India, which one is more important? Of course, Taiwan first, because it's got this whole nationalism built around it. But then the day, sadly enough, Taiwan falls, India won't be far behind, because China would just want more and more and more of Indian territory, etc. Could they use this moment right now? Because, the whole world's attention is deflected. The focus on Russia, Ukraine is getting diluted. I was reading in bits and pieces as to how there are murmurings that, maybe Ukraine should be persuaded to come to a peace deal with Russia. Clearly, energies are just getting too diverted across the conflicts in the world. So the focus on Russia, Ukraine is lost. Israel, Middle East is, of course, burning. US's attention on the Taiwan Straits also, of course, is diluted. So could China make something out of this? It can definitely do so. But my reading is it would still wait and watch for a little bit more time. Maybe it'll further try to fuel the fire in the Middle East so that it's absolutely sure that, none of the Western forces can come to the rescue of Taiwan. Well, India never asks for any sort of rescue. Indian army stands its own ground on its own. But it'll just wait and watch, and it'll keep doing its shady deals and keep empowering these terrorists and revisionist powers.
Yes, I mean, well, it's more than clear that this may be one of the very, core Chinese strategy to drain the American effort, resources, and energy. But with this also question arises, how would Israelis deal with the Chinese now? I mean, they have like robust economic ties, and well, I can tell you from my personal interaction with the several Israeli diplomats and my friends that they're really quite puzzled about it. So, what would be their response? Because for them, on one hand, you have a robust economic partnership with China, and on the other hand, they're fighting this existential battle against Hamas. So, in your opinion, what would be their policy?
See, I think, as has been pointed out earlier also, China's deep pockets are the reasons. Dr. Waghmar also pointed out as to why, be it Western countries or even India, we don't take as tough a stance as we actually should against China for all its violations of, this established international laws. Simply because China can arm twist economically. China actively uses weaponization of trade, etc. What can Israel really do? Israel's economy, of course, is suffering quite a huge shock, but that's something right now which is secondary, because first, right now, it's essential that Hamas is obliterated so that they cannot repeat what they did on October 7th. Once things settle down, there will be churnings to get back the Israeli economy. In fact, it has already started. I think I just before this webinar started, I read that from here on, Israel would be talking more to India for sending in labor, because now they would not be allowing Palestinian labor because for whatever their national security concerns, their calculations, etc. So the churnings have started. Could they rely on China? As I mentioned, this poor family of a terror attack of a person who was killed in a terrorist attack in 2006. They were already fighting a case against the Bank of China because they have fueled, these terrorists in Palestine. But sadly enough, Israel backtracked because deep pockets. Let's hope that after this, Israel is cautious enough. While my understanding of Israel is, and I think Dr. Waghmar would know more about it because he's more of an expert over there, is that while economics is very important, for a country like Israel, survival is very important. So I hope from here on, because survival has been attacked in such a bad manner, from here on, Israel can understand that it needs to think of itself first. And whenever there are shady deals, they might just help terrorists, which will attack its survival.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak. Thank you. So, Burzine, I come back to you with some more fundamental aspects. Now, this conflict has already started, and we are calling it a defining moment for the existing world order. Now, let us do a bit of a strategic forecasting. I know the astrologers are doing a better job at it these days, but yes, in your opinion, do you think this conflict can escalate? And if it escalates, to what extent? Like right now, we don't know what's going to happen after, like, let's say, Israelis conquer Gaza. Do they have an arrangement for setting up a government or a ruling authority in Gaza? Definitely, the Arabs have been quite reluctant to put in a joint Arab force to govern the Gaza. If they set the place free, maybe after 4 years, 5 years, the Gazans will come back. The Hamas or some other substitute will come back with double the force and they will start killing Israelis. Perhaps the Americans may not be as powerful as they are 5 years down the line, and they may not be in the position to help the Israelis against against these Hamas and other terrorist actors. Iran may have the nuclear weapons. So what do you foresee? Like, I mean, can this escalate into something really major, a global war? Let's say, some kind of a World War III like situation.
I hope not. I hope not, much as some prognosis has been made on that count. Hezbollah so far has just about, repeat, just about stayed its hand, because it knows if Lebanon is sucked into it, this time Lebanon would be completely finished as a state. If you think Pakistan is an unstable state, I say this to Indian and other South Asian viewers, just pause for a moment and think of ramshackle Lebanon, which actually makes Pakistan look respectable. I mean, a country with a full-fledged army which doesn't desert at the moment's notice, which is a paid, salaried, professional civil service compared to what Lebanon is. It's a joke out there. It may be the Paris of the East, and people may enjoy a good time in Beirut by the Corniche, having ice creams and the rest of it. But Lebanon as a state, for all purposes and intents, since 1943 is a joke and is run like a little Mediterranean mafia. And people know that Hezbollah would completely take the country down the tubes. So they may resist some pressure from Tehran, though Tehran, of course, is thoroughly gloating and enjoying all this. But at the same time, the point is this. Javad Zarif, former foreign minister, seems to have very cockily surmised recently that the Biden administration is not enthusiastic of taking on Iran. And we have seen how weak the administration has been as such, ever since the Obama era, with signing of that ill-fated 2015 nuclear deal, which I was dead set against. That Biden would not like to take Iran full on. And that does drive Tehran. It drives Tehran because it's, again, a God-sent distraction from its local problems, since it's so busy killing its own population, its own youth, who are drenched in blood and shot dead, the protests that have been taking place since September last. So, like Putin's Russia, this provides an excellent distraction for Iran. But, of course, the Iranian population is not buying into it. If you see Mr. Pandya protests at Tehran's soccer stadiums, there are crowds in the audience are screaming against Hamas and the Palestinians. This has nothing to do with us, which tells you something about a rare Muslim voice, the Iranian Muslim voice, that is to say, who do not align themselves with the regime, which is a discredited one. That is, Iranians, I repeat, at Tehran soccer stadiums, chanting against the regime for supporting Hamas, that we don't support such terrorism. And also Iranian groups in exile abroad are the only Muslim groups, as we've seen demonstrations even yesterday in Paris and elsewhere, who speak out against Hamas and stand with Israel. And that takes me back to 9/11, when it was Tehranis who came out with candlelight vigils on that Tuesday night after the towers went down in Manhattan. They were the only ones in the Gulf who were actually commiserating with America and to what happened. The Iranian population who were showing to their own country's mullahs and regime that we stand with America on this, in sharp contrast to Palestinians who were cheering as the towers came down, as videos later showed to us as such. So there is this jockeying in the region that has to be taken into consideration, that it simply doesn't go out of hand. But here again, the historian will come in, and I notice Nina Slammer is there, and she may have seen my tweets because we follow each other. But I want to point out again, Nina, I simply hope Netanyahu does not, and the Israelis, cave in and do a June 1982 with Beirut, because Arafat was allowed to exit. As I've kept pointing out repeatedly at various fora, Arafat was allowed to exit Lebanon. He made a beeline for Tunis, and he remained there until, of course, the talks happened under Clinton and the rest of it with Oslo. But Ariel Sharon's hand was held back. He was not allowed to finish Arafat and the Palestinian militia, who took Lebanon practically into the sea as a country back then. I fear this time that there should not be some exit policy for the kidnapped Israelis to be released, that some Hamas commanders may be allowed to exit for, obviously, Qatar or elsewhere. That remains my patent fear as a historian, because so much in the Middle East repeats itself time and again, Mr. Pandya. And, you know, it's like my old teacher used to say, Professor James Will in Virginia, in the Middle East, things go from bad to worse, and then the cycle repeats itself back to worse. And final point, coming back to a little bit more history again, to inform Israelis on this program and elsewhere. This October 7th incident may have been Israel's 9/11 moment, and it occurred, which many were fearing over the years it would have. And I'm sorry to say it did. But Israel's 9/11 moment would have occurred back in September 1986 with that Pan Am flight PA-73, which left Bombay for New York via Karachi and was hijacked by that Jordanian Zaid al-Safarani. And what was Mr. Safarani's ultimate goal, Mr. Pandya, as we now know, through the depositions and the case? He wanted to take that 747 and ram it into the Israeli Parliament Knesset building. So a 9/11 would have happened in 1986, not in 2001. It would have happened in Tel Aviv and not Manhattan. That is something to be borne in mind too. People tend to forget this historic aspect. And I wanted Israelis to know it. I'm sure they do. They know their history better than I would. And I'm an Iranist by training. I'm not an Israeli studies scholar. But as a Middle East historian, I'm at pains to just put that in perspective for this webinar. That it needs to be noted that 9/11 would have occurred back then and not as it happened now. Thank you.
Thank you, Burzine. So one final last question before I end this webinar. The Indian strategic establishment, including diplomats and experts, as Dr. Pathak also know, they are really obsessed with the idea of two-state solution. I remember distinctly that we used to read this term in our class 12 NCERT books. So this is something which comes from the Cold War days, and it seems that subject expertise or the knowledge has not moved forward after 1990. And even now, you can hear many experts, diplomats, retired diplomats talking about two-state solution. But when you look at the ground reality in Israel, already there were 3 states existing: West Bank, Gaza, Israel. The Israelis left Gaza in 2005-6. After that, they have been nurturing this Hamas has been prevailing in that area, ruling that area, because Israelis knew that there is no good exit strategy from Gaza, so better to leave it to Gazans, to the Hamas. Now they realize that leaving it to Hamas is the worst strategy. So please talk a little bit more about this whole idea of two-state solution and how, I find it very irrational. I would like to know your opinion. what is this all about?
Dr. Pathak first, then I'll come in. Later.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you so much. As Dr. Pandya rightly pointed out, we've been reading about the two-state solution, but I think you've encapsulated it really well. Since 2005, Israel actually pulled out whatever little forces it has, and there was a two-state already, or rather three-state, as you said, right? And whatever the differences are between the PLO and Hamas, they existed. And on a daily basis, Palestinians used to come into Israel on their work permits. They used to work and they used to go back. Now, while a lot of these terrorist sympathizers are talking about save Palestine from Hamas, really, even before October 7, there are scores of videos and scores of accounts as to how Palestinians themselves have been killed. Hamas uses them as human shields, and I don't need to get into the details of that. When the world keeps parroting, we should have a two-state solution. What was there since 2005? What was existing then? If you want to find out what is the basic rationale behind Hamas's attack on Israel, it's really to death to the Jews, as simple as that. They do not want a two-state. A two, or rather three-state was already existing, but they don't want that. They want one state, and they want death to the Jews, as simple as that. So while the world and the sympathizers are talking about two-state solution, the fact is that needs to be preached to the terrorist organization or to the violent non-state actor. First of all, it needs to be obliterated. And secondly, it needs to be understood that this has been existing. What else can be done, beyond this? So we really need to move beyond, and we need to see the reality and maybe smell the coffee. So.
Absolutely right, Dr. Pathak. And imagine this whole idea of two-state solution. You have a terrorist organization right in your neighbor, running a country, running a failed state, and it borders not just Israel, several other Arab countries also. So people who are talking about this whole this nonsense of two-state solution, they really need to understand it. What are they exactly talking? So I don't want to waste more time. I guess let's go to Burzine, and Burzine has many more interesting points to add to this discussion. Burzine.
Well, and actually depressing points. And the first depressing point is Indian academics or diplomats leave much to be desired when it comes to Middle Eastern studies. They never impressed me in the last 50 years of my life, and I don't think they'll impress me in the time left to me, how many soever years I have left. That's point number one. Point number two, India may claim to have its own reasoning because of the third or fourth largest Muslim population in mind to keep at home in mind. That's all very well. But at the same time, I would like to remind Indians who seem to forget so much, conveniently or otherwise, that you also have a 5,000 strong Jewish population in your country, which has been there as old as the Zoroastrian Parsi population from the 9th and 10th century onwards. So, I mean, people think of Zoroastrians as about a good 35,000 in a population of, say, 1.4 of 1.5 billion. That is truly a micro minority. But if you think that's a micro minority, how about sparing a moment and thinking of Jews who are barely 4 to 5,000 left in India? That would be worth talking about. And so I would point that out, and I would even shame Indians publicly in speaking about a true beleaguered minority that they don't wish to mention. Concomitantly, I would hasten to add, if that sounds overcritical, that India has never had a history of anti-Semitism. Like China too, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, did not have an actual history of anti-Semitism until it came about with these ultra-nationalist narratives that we see in Chinese cyberspace recently. But we do see now within the Indian page 3 academics and page 3 celebrities and the like who talk about Palestinian rights. Yes, but at the same time, they don't seem to understand that. They don't seem to understand Jewish exceptionalism, Jewish history, an understanding of the Holocaust, and where Jewry is coming from. Which is why I said very sharply that Indians are ignoramuses and don't seem to understand the first thing about what they're talking about when they talk about Palestine, including these diplomats and ministers and what have you. I do have a very low opinion of them, and I'm entirely justified in maintaining so. Zionism for me, but not for you. Pakistan as a Muslim Zion is permitted, and nobody questions its existence or its survival. But Jewish Zion as a homeland predicated on religious nationalism somehow is problematic for a liberal establishment, whether Indian academics or Indian diplomats. Last time I checked, there was no Holocaust of Indian Muslims in late 40s British India. But there were factories and plants which were churning out dead Jewish corpses across Nazi-occupied Europe, which led to the creation of that state in May 1948. So that also needs to be brought into the Indian perspective to bear. And like I mentioned, India may make all these polite noises because of its own Muslim population at home, or it has to be seen as offering a sop to them. But at the same time, it has a Jewish population that it should be aware of and ought to take their sentiments into consideration instead of just simply playing vote bank politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Burzine and Dr. Pathak. I mean, definitely, I guess, I mean, Indian maybe diplomats or the professors, academia, the think tank people, they need to educate themselves a little more that this is more about religion. Because in my umpteen number of interactions with the Kashmiri religious clerics and militants, they often say that, well, I mean, their first enemy, first target is Jews, not India. After that, they will come back to you, but first target is Jews. And the whole raison d'etre behind attacking Israel and all these terrorist actions is just the very idea of the existence of Jews and the Jewish state. I mean, it's not about two-state solution. It's not about, yes, please.
Sorry, before I lose my thought, Dr. Pandya, I'm very sorry, very, very sorry for the interjection. Again, Islamic history comes to the picture. The region of what became Palestine and Jerusalem after the Romans expelled the Jews in AD 70, and after Caliph Abdul Malik conquered it under the Umayyad dynasty and the coming of Islam. Muslim understanding is that once lands are Islamized, they are sacralized and they are part of the Ummah. And unraveling of that goes against the very tenets of Islamic doctrine and history. It's an aberration and it must be contained. That's why also now in the case of Kashmir, which is a very late entrant to Islam, Kashmir only got Islamized in the 15th century, which is pretty late in the Islamic scheme of things, if you think about it. Other lands were much earlier Islamized. so the part of Palestine that I refer to, and Jerusalem, or Al-Quds, as the Muslims deem as a third holiest site, it is this that grates on their sensibilities. The Zoroastrians went down in Iran, and Iran became Islamized. The Jews came back after 2,000 odd years to create a state, and that is a slap in the face of Muslims. Just as Armenians survived a 1915 genocide by the Turks and came back to claim a state. Yes, it was part of the Soviet Union as a puppet, as a Soviet Socialist Republic. But after 1992, the Armenians have survived and managed something of a state. So Jews and Armenians are the only two groups who stand out as sore thumbs, which Muslims cannot accept because it upends their assumptions as triumphalist votaries of a very proud faith with a very vivid sense of identity and belonging, that Muslims must be first among equals in this world and the next, and that lands sacralized for Muslims must remain Islamized, which is why territory, you see the same argument which Osama used to make in his tirades, not against US troops in Saudi Arabia, which of course that was there too, but against Granada and southern Spain and the Almohavid Caliphate that existed in southern Spain, that it should go back to the Muslims. So this kind of argument is consistently played up, which not just Indian, but other diplomats and other academics don't realize, who do not have a deep understanding of Oriental history, or at least Islamic history, to understand the Muslim psyche and where it's coming from. That this is for them an aberration, it's an affront to their sensibilities and all that they hold and know to cherish as Islamic values. That is what really gets them, and they cannot bear Israel sticking out like a sore thumb, and then they make it out to be a colonial settler implanted in the middle of the Middle East, without realizing that Jews were part of the fabric of the Middle East, and Jews were even in Arabia before Islam arrived as such. Thank you.
Thanks, Burzine. You're right. Such Islamized lands, they officially become the part of Waqf, and then it becomes incumbent upon all the Muslims to reclaim those Waqf lands, and that is also one of the most important rationale behind this whole idea of Ghazwa-e-Hind. Well, that can be a topic for another session, another time. So thank you very much. Today we had this very interesting and comprehensive discussion. We tried to touch upon some of the interesting aspects of this conflict, the role of the local actors, the international actors, the possible chances of escalation, and also some like dreamy notions which are particularly loved in India, like the idea of two-state solution. And once again, I guess, personally, I also learned a lot from both these presentations. I would like to thank both our panelists today and also the audience who joined us for this interesting discussion. Thank you very much. Hopefully, I'll see you very soon for the next discussion. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.